Now, today we've shared aspirations for the world as we wish it to be. This is a historic gathering of activists, visionaries and experts of diverse genders, sexualities and sex characteristics in a country still grappling with the impacts of colonisation, just like the rest of our region. The voices of First Nations people in this discussion is absolutely vital. Our final segment today develops on the themes we've been hearing across the day on decolonisation, sovereignty, and First Nations justice in the Asia-Pacific region. The facilitator of this session is my friend, Whadjuk Noongar journalist, Narelda Jacobs.
I'm so blessed to call Jeremy my friend. What an amazing job did Jeremy and the whole ABC team do of last weekend, all of the events. Hello folks, so great to see you. Let's meet our panel. Let's bring them in straight away. Please put your hands together for Dr. Elizabeth Kirikiri, MP, Member of New Zealand Parliament, Aotearoa. Woo! What a fierce entry. Okay, everyone's going to have to do better than that. I don't know. That's going to be hard, though. Elizabeth, you are an LGBTQIA plus activist and scholar and also a Member of Parliament. How do you feel being here?
It is a joy, absolute joy to be here with all of you today.
It gives me great pleasure to also welcome to the stage Tim Goodwin, he, him, Ewan man and barrister who now lives in Melbourne. Tim, you've got a strut when you come out, by the way. So great to have you with us, Tim.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
It gives me great pleasure as well to introduce to you Imania Brown, she, her, Samoan Whakawhine, and Co-Secretary General of ILGA World and the Project Lead of Equality Australia, Imania. And finally we have Dr. Sen Raj, he, him, Associate Professor in Human Rights Law at Manchester Law School and Chair of Amnesty International UK. I'm going to move my chair around so I can see everyone. Please make sure you're comfortable. Everyone's feeling really good. So the theme of our panel is decolonisation, sovereignty and First Nations justice in the Asia-Pacific. Who in our panel ate this for breakfast? This is our life, this is what we do. Elizabeth, I'm going to start with you. You've dedicated your entire life to looking into the impacts of colonisation and research into pre-colonisation. Where do we even start? What research did you find? How inclusive was all of the things that we're talking about at this conference pre-colonisation?
Cool.
What's the research and the proof that you found?
Okay, firstly, I want to ngamahi atu ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe e te iwi Gadigal, me ngā kaumātua o tēnei po I tēnei eo. So, greetings to the people of this land, from our mountains, our rivers, our lakes and seas, we greet yours, and to all of you and the cultures, spiritualities and languages you bring into this space. What we know is that in the Māori, we're the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and takatapui is a word which we found in our ancient writings when our people were first taught to write, because the English came in whilst taking all our land and language, said we'll teach us natives how to use their pen and paper. And in those writings was the word takatapui, which means originally an intimate companion of the same sex. And so we've reclaimed it in this, over the last few decades, to include all of our whānau, all of our people with diverse genders, sexualities and sex characteristics. So we found proof in two different ways. The English who came here with all their diaries and their anthropologists who came to study us, but also in our Māori, in our traditional narratives. We were an oral speaking people. And so all our stories, we found references, and it was like being a detective to find those things. And so we take that knowledge and we use it as the platform to say pre-colonial times, our people were a normal, sometimes average, I'm sure some of us were fabulous back then, but actually just a normal part of life, accepted and part of the world until colonisation came. But we use that to say, in fact, we're not asking for anything new for our rights. We would like the rights that we already had restored to us.
Yes.
And just to close that off, the final thing, when the English came, they tried to take all of our they tried to take all of our language and culture. They also tried to suppress the fact that we ever existed. They failed rather spectacularly.
Oh, yes. Tim, there is less research that's been done in Australia amongst First Nations people to prove the same things that Elizabeth are talking about, but it was there. I mean, these things are as old as sovereignty itself. And I think it goes to show within leadership, within community, how are we seeing some of those pre-colonisation things about, gender and sexuality being played out today that kind of is surviving amongst our culture. That is proof that it existed pre-colonisation.
Yeah, well, there's so much richness to Indigenous culture that is so layered and hard to unpack and hard to understand unless you are deeply enriched in it. And that's something that's the power of culture for a lot of us First Nations people. And it's really amazing to see that the importance of kinship in relation to country is so much more important than some of the superficial introductions of concepts of gender and power relationships between the sexes. You had the significance of men's and women's business. You had the much more important relationships of kin amongst family than the idea of the nuclear family or, to essentially procreate and own property. So there's a depth and complexity that I think in many ways has been maintained, no matter the evolution of culture here for First Nations people, but is also being reasserted in really powerful ways by First Nations people across the country through nation-building movements like The Voice and Treaty, through to the proper naming of place on the grounds of our rivers, of our creeks, of our mountains, of our lakes, of our spaces. All of this goes to a reassertion of the ancientness of our culture that is at the heart of who we are and what we do, and that includes queer identities, trans identities, and the powerful brother boy and sister girl movement in the Tiwi Islands has been such a important inspirational movement for so many of us on the mainland. And that's deeply rooted in culture. People should understand that. That's deeply rooted in a sense of Aboriginality as well as a sense of queer and trans identity. And that's really important for,
and there's evidence in language, isn't there? There's evidence in the language. Where I come from, Noongar country, there is a word, Baal, B-A-A-L, that means they. So there, and that's evident in maybe the lack of pronouns within First Nations languages. That there are none.
Yeah. I was recently involved in a native title case where a significant elder was giving evidence, and you could just track it through the transcript that he switched between he and she. Literally, just he used he first, then she, then he, then she to refer to anyone who he was referring to or a group of people. The pronoun didn't really matter. It was his relationship as kin to certain people, and he just had to use an English word to describe that. But there was, of course, a layer of complexity underneath what he was identifying as his relationship to kin.
Imania, can you give us a bit of a snapshot of what life might have looked like in Samoa pre-colonisation?
So I can give you a very realistic, real picture about what it was like before colonization. In Samoa, there's a concept called whaasinomanga, or your place. And Whaafine and Whaatama had a place in community. They had a place in culture. And it's not just in Samoa, it's in Tonga, in Fiji, in like every other country in the Pacific. There is an identity like mine, Whaafine. There is a name for it, and there is a place for them in community. So this is before colonization. And it's quite often that you find that in most Pacific countries, there was more than 2 genders, you know, and they were welcome, they were a part of community, they were leaders, they were entitled to traverse the vatapuia, or the distance between 2 genders, you know. And an example of that was in the tsunami that hit Samoa recently. The church leaders actually came to the Samoa Whaafine Association because we had to set up spaces for men and spaces for women. And you know who were the ones that were able to go to both? The Whaafine. So they were able to help because they relied on their culture. They relied on traversing that distance between, right? And look, we talk about pronouns and the importance of language. My pronouns are not she, her, or he, him, or they, and no disrespect to everyone who has those pronouns. My pronouns are Samoan. So, you know, when you ask me what my pronouns are, either you call me Lauafionga, Lautofa, or Laususunga. And it's really important because it's not just in my culture, it's around Pacific, it's around the world. We all have language, and when we talk about the decolonization, we also have to talk about language because that's really, really important to decolonize the use of indigenous and traditional language.
Yeah. Yes, very important. Sen, we'll come to you. There's a lot of that has been written in the world, a lot of research to prove that, you know, non-binary people have been long revered as spiritual and leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if you look at cultural contexts in Asia, and I'm most familiar with kind of Sri Lanka and southern India, you see the kind of revering of particular deities who kind of defy binary gender. They have many avatars, manifestations, they reference concepts and ideas. And I think that richness is really reflected in certain religious practices, in scriptural and spiritual practices. But unfortunately, what we've seen is the politicization of these particular traditions in ways that are unhelpful. So, for example, you know, people will now, you know, talk about, you know, gay or trans people not existing in a particular country or in a particular space, and trying to mobilize, if you like, a sort of post-colonial argument to say, well, these are all Western inventions or Western concepts that you're trying to corrupt our society. But actually, if you look historically and you look culturally, as you know, all of the speakers here have so eloquently pointed out, you see our existence, and we defy the kind of labels that people want to put on us, but we were there. And actually what really is the importation was the laws, the policies, the practices that attempted to police and extinguish our existence to fit into these very narrow stereotypes of what it means to be a civilized man or a civilized woman and what is considered a moral or righteous relationship. So I think, you know, as we have these conversations, we really need to be attuned to the kind of differences culturally and historically, and also to recognize the way that politicians and other individuals try and thwart or sort of challenge our histories in a way to serve their sort of homophobic or transphobic agendas.
Yeah, well said. We talked about pronouns there. Elizabeth, your pronouns, you have three pronouns: she, her,
and ia.
And ia.
Just the letters I and A. We didn't have gendered pronouns. We didn't have a lot of gendered language because the nuclear family was an import that came into our country. So we had what I imagine in many parts of the world where the whole generation looked after the generation of children. And so we didn't have words for mother or father, son or daughter. It was just the matua, the ones who looked after the next generation. And so a lot of our elders, when we are trying to explain exactly what our sister was saying, is when we try to explain to our people these things that we are trying to change or trying to fight discrimination of, we must describe it in cultural terms. We must describe it in our language for them to understand. Because otherwise, there's a story, a discourse that says that these are all imported identities. And so, of course, we have always been here. We will always be here. And we might have used different names, or we might have had no names for it because it was so normal. One of our elders, they said, one of our elders and one of our mentors asked his grandmother, what was the name for it? And the name was Mukapuna, which means grandchild. That's what we called them. No matter how we identified, no matter how we lived our life, these are our children, these are our grandchildren. And it was just normal. I dedicated my life to that some of our kids will grow up having that.
So ia, everyone is ia. Everyone
He,
is
she, it. So it can be used for, they can be, it's just a generic term without gender.
Sen, you grew up in Australia and you now live in Manchester in the UK. When you come back to Australia, does it feel like we are a colony?
Wow, that's such a rich and difficult question, Imelda. So, yes, it's quite interesting, I think, you know, being a migrant and a settler and kind of navigating those relationships on different lands that I've lived in or resided in. I'd say that, you know, being in the UK, you know, that is empire. That is the, you know, when we talk about the process of British colonisation of vast parts of the world, it started there. The policies and the practices exported, you know, all over the world. I think that here, politically, we're seeing the persistence of these kinds of colonial practices even today in the way we communicate, the way we talk, in language, in culture, in representations in the media, but also in our institutions. You know, I think that's also a really important point that I want to make, is that, you know, the concept of coloniality is one that's ongoing, and it's one that is spread around the world. So people like to think about colonization or colonialism as finished, but we know it's present in various insidious ways, in laws, in policies, in practices that still persist. And there's a real transnational life to them, right? So one of the things that I've been able to witness kind of living here, living in the UK, and, you know, my family is from Jaffna in Sri Lanka. I lived for a few years in Lagos in Nigeria, so I often describe myself as a kind of traumatized Commonwealth subject, given the kind of complex migration histories and settler histories that I have. And yet what I'm reminded of in all those places I've lived is how colonization was ever present in all those spaces and has a real kind of life in politics, in society, in culture, in different ways in all those places. So to come back to your question, Narelda, I would say yes, but I would also say so are many other places in the world today. And it's kind of, you know, a kind of a disturbing reminder of how much we still have to do to kind of dismantle those structures.
It's what the colonies have in common, isn't it? That's why we are colonies. You have another way of describing what you do. You're an associate professor in human rights law at Manchester. You have another phrase that you use? Yeah,
you know, my friends call me a professional gay, so yeah.
And I think all of our panel are professional gay, and to be that person, that means you've had to rise up through a system. And sometimes, you know, you have to fit into that system to be able to rise through the ranks of it. Tim, what do you do once you rise to where you are, to where you are as a barrister in a court of law, representing people in human rights and discrimination cases, and etc.?
Well, I think it goes to Sen's challenge of remaking and recrafting the institutions around us, and I think you need people to play their part in different ways in order to do that. You know, the classic in the tent and out of the tent dynamic, as well as just infiltrating all those spaces in order to ensure that we're remaking them in a way that serves everyone's purpose. And that was what's been so striking about so many of the presentations that I've witnessed today, is to really notice that at the heart of the colonial project is really to suppress identity and to subjugate people of difference, and that's something that a lot of us have in common across a number of our identities, and particularly me as a gay Aboriginal man. And really that means, as I think a lot of people have said today, that until all of us are free, none of us are free. And I think that's really important to remember when we think about the movement. And that also means confronting a number of demons. The traditional public whiteness of our movement, of the queer movement, is something that we have to confront. It isn't necessarily something that people have to apologise for, but it is something that people have to recognise their own sense of privilege, no matter their identity. I have male privilege. My sexuality and my culture doesn't erase that for me. It makes the expression of it different, but I have male privilege. And we need to remember that privilege and carve spaces to ensure that we're surrendering that privilege in order for those who don't have voice or need access to certain places, to institutions, in order to properly remake them. We need to recognise that it's incumbent on us to do that, and I think that's really important for our movement to grapple with. And it's most important for us to do it when it comes to the First Peoples of this country, because it's our relationship to this land that was ripped away from us, that now everybody has privilege to live on and benefit from, no matter your circumstance in life. That has come at the expense of of First Nations, of their dispossession and disassociation from their language, from culture and from country. And so it is deeply incumbent on all of us to recognise that and to play our part in ensuring that those historic systemic injustices are done away with in this country.
Yes. Elizabeth, you are within an institution, the Parliament of Aotearoa. What are the impacts of colonisation in Aotearoa? You know, you talked about, you know, the strength in culture. You know, how are you seeing colonisation being played out in New Zealand?
I think we share the history of colonised people who are Indigenous all across the world. We see that in the statistics in our education, health, that we die younger. In our justice system, we're more likely to be charged, convicted and stay in jail for longer. In all of the demographics that exist generally, we are the worst. And I'll also acknowledge our Pacifica peoples, who usually are sitting down the bottom with us. But we also want to emphasise the strengths that we have, because we believe that our culture, our language, will be the thing that saves us. And when I became a member of Parliament, and people said, how can you be? We're absolutely in the bastion of colonisation in this Parliament. We're there on, was the Queen and now the King, on their sufferance. And I thought, no, I'm here because this is my land. And every single day, if I don't subvert the processes that happen in those halls of power, then I'm colluding with them. So I'm very clear why I'm there. Yep.
How hard is it to show that resistance? What do you come up against when you show that resistance?
Some people try to resist back.
Yeah. Because this is what happens is you rise through the ranks by being a certain person, and then when you get to the top and you have that platform and you have that, you know, you feel empowered to be able to speak because people are listening, and then you say the things that they don't want to hear, then it's like, oh well, we didn't put you here to say that. So that's kind of it's kind of a blessing, isn't it, really, to be able to rise there, and then you're there. You're sort of beating them at their own game in a way.
In some ways, I haven't changed at all what I say. And I'm with the Green Party, so it gives us a lot of leeway. We're not one of the big parties in New Zealand, and so we are an activist-based party. So it's a strength that we bring into that space. So, and it's very, very important. I'm only in my first term. We're actually in the process of list ranking, and we're going to have an election this year. I aim to keep my job, because still got plenty to do. But again, it's that thing of just remembering why we're there and always being my authentic self, but always in everything in the campaigns I run is that we're working directly with our community, with our leaders on the ground. They tell me what to do and I do it.
Wonderful. Imania, if I can turn to you and the impacts of colonisation in Samoa, we often see it played out in the way faith sometimes is seen as the most important thing in Samoa. And I'm not going to go into specific examples, but there are lots of times where Samoan community members and the broader community will allow particular Samoan people who don't want to recognise the rainbow colours or LGBTQIA plus elements of their institutions or whatever it might be, by saying, oh, but it's their faith, it's their religion, they're allowed to. But when in Samoa did religion become recognised as culture?
So it's a good question, and for those of you who don't understand what Narelda is asking, I think if you just bring up your phones and Google Manly Jersey Saga, you'll all be knowing what I'm talking about. Anyway, the issue around religion, the lives of Samoan citizens, and for most Pacific Island citizens, are governed under three very important pillars. The first one is culture, or yoanganu, right? It's the culture that kind of like, it's our position in life, it's who we are, it's family, it's everything about the way we live our lives. The second one is the laws of the land. Now, in most Pacific countries, we not only have laws, L-A-W-S, we also have law, L-O-R-E, which is really, really important and often overlooked in the L-A-W discourse or discussions. And of course, the very third pillar is religion. Now, those three are supposed to exist in symbiosis with each other, and when one moves forward, if there's too much culture, religion and the laws will peg it back a little bit. It's supposed to govern the lives of people in the Pacific. What happens is, when religion gets too far in advance, they have a tendency to flick clobber passages at us, especially the LGBTI people of the Pacific, because they're very selective in how they use Bible passages to penalize and criminalize and really make us to be the sinners of this world. But what they don't read is the other parts of, Leviticus and all the other sins of Leviticus, which talks about planting crops and mixing fabrics and working on Sunday. Nobody ever talks about that, but they all want to talk about sodomy because, it's titillating, it's amazing. It's like, oh my God, let's just penalize the gays and the lesbians and the trans, It's not supposed to work like that. If we are going to talk about decolonization, we cannot just talk about the decolonization of laws. We have to talk about the decolonization of religion. We have to talk about decolonization of systems. We have to talk about decolonization of knowledge and the introduction of indigenous knowledge, which is being taken advantage of by pharmaceuticals. We all know that. In Samoa, the case of the mamala plant, which is now used to produce HIV medicine. Only healers, the women in Samoa, knew about this for centuries. If we're going to talk about decolonization, let's decolonize the health systems. Let's decolonize the education system. It's not just about the laws, it's every aspect of our lives that we need to decolonize, including our minds and our bodies. We need to decolonize that.
Yes.
Right?
That was very powerfully said. I know there's representatives of a lot of those industries and sectors that you just spoke of, and faiths as well. And I think the debate over the Manly Sea Eagles playing jumper really hit home the fact that religion isn't homophobic. People are. Culture isn't homophobic. People are. There's a huge difference in that. Sen, I'd love to move to talking about how we mourn. Oh, yes? What would you like to-
I just wanted to add one more thing about the manly sea.
Oh, yeah, okay, yep.
We focused on the players who didn't want to play, and they used the religion card to not want to play. What we should have focused on was the other 13 players that
Yes.
wanted to play
Yes.
and wanted to wear the rainbow.
Yes.
Those are the people we should have focused on.
Yes. Sen, I asked you what it was like to live in the UK, coming from a colony. So what was it like to mourn the Queen in the UK?
Well, first... Wow. Okay, how do I unpack this in a way that will fit?
than one queen.
You know, yeah. Well, oh yeah, I like to think of myself as a queen, I guess. So, but the Queen. I mean, I'll just start by saying that, you know, I personally didn't mourn the Queen, and I think, you know, it's an opportunity for us to reflect on the role of the monarchy in society and sort of the history of colonization, because I think so often people forget that these symbols, whether it's, you know, Queen Elizabeth or others, they're people, of course, but they also represent institutions. So when people are criticizing or pointing out the violence of an institution, it's not a personal attack. And unfortunately, what I witnessed during the time of that mourning was any attempt to kind of draw attention to the violence of colonization, the histories and the present, the ways in which a number of quote-unquote post-colonial nations are still struggling, you know, facing climate change, they've been dispossessed, poverty, and, you know, the kind of redistribution of resources, these kinds of questions. It was almost to be seen as disrespectful or blasphemous at an extreme, you know, to point this out during a time of national mourning. And I think it's so important that we are willing to have these conversations precisely in those moments, because it's so easy for that kind of, if you want to call it a sort of compulsory nationalism, if you like, to take hold, and it then starts to obscure all the realities that are still existing, you know, in the day-to-day, that, you know, poverty doesn't stop. We might have a national holiday, but that still continues. You know, domestic violence still continues. The marginalization of LGBTIQ people still continues. The detention and deportation of people who seek asylum still continues. So, you know, I often try and point out in those moments that, you know, yes, people can have complicated relationships to icons and to institutions, but we also cannot allow ourselves to use any one moment as an excuse to then, you know, completely erase all the other injuries and harms that are still existing in the world. And that's something that I was kind of pointing out, and I know others were and continue to do.
Were people allowed to speak out in the UK?
I mean, yes. I mean, I think what was really quite troubling, though, at the time was, you know, we saw protesters, you know, with, you know, signs, you know, criticizing the monarchy, and then them being moved on by the police. And, you know, in the UK at the moment, we're seeing the kind of introduction of really draconian anti-protest legislation, which we're seeing in different parts of the world, unfortunately, which is a real attempt to stifle freedom of expression. And I think it's quite telling, in fact, that a lot of these nation states and governments that like to talk about how they value freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of expression, and like to chastise a lot of the kind of former colonies for their, you know, backward laws and their failure to uphold these freedoms, are the ones pursuing and pushing this very legislation that will make it much harder, particularly for marginalized groups of people who often have to protest their lives, have to protest their existence, and that is a concerted attack on our communities. And I think it is so important that we continue to resist and to speak out, because we know we will still face hostility and policing as a result of it.
Well, in Australia, there was comments made that we tried to out-colonise the colonisers by shutting our parliament for 2 whole weeks when Britain only shut it for a matter of a few days. TV, you know, there was rolling coverage on all of our networks. All the presenters that you would see were having to wear black, whether they liked it or not, and it was, you know, was that the experience in Aotearoa?
Absolutely. There was this outpouring of grief, and any time those of us who had issues with the extreme privilege of the royal family and the fact that their entire wealth is built on the backs and deaths of Indigenous people around the world, you weren't allowed to say that without saying, oh, this is not the right time. But I think it is the right time, because what we see is the fact that we die younger, the fact that we languish in prisons, the fact that our young people would rather give up on hope and do not grow old. But we will celebrate this one life. The entire world will celebrate this one life. That's privilege. And every day is a good day to say the monarchy sucks.
Because it was by order of whoever was reigning at the time. In Australia, I think it was a king at the time, to say that you had to settle with agreement of the people, and so they knew, the monarchy knew that there was no agreement, and yet they did nothing. And
Yes.
I mean, Tim, to say that the relationship with a lot of First Nations people in Australia with the royals is complicated is kind of an understatement. I mean, my dad received an MBE from the Queen herself and loved the royal family. And there's the same thing in Aotearoa. There are First Nations people who love the royal family. So
absolutely,
it's
and
very
they were
complicated.
sad and they cried. And also this thing about, she was a grandmother, she was a great-grandmother who people do genuinely mourn for her, and it's like, that's okay, but you can still mention all the atrocities that her wealth and privilege.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, Tim, it's a really good test to see, okay, institution, organisation, club, if you are really strong on diversity and inclusion, you will allow people the space not to mourn as you might be mourning. Did that kind of play out during that whole period?
Yeah, well, I think what this conversation has shown is that we have to think about the psyche that led Australia and New Zealand to go above and beyond her own home country in terms of the way in which public mourning occurred. And it's that psyche that's concerning to me, because it speaks to a level of immaturity about ourselves and our sense of comfort with our own identity as Australians, speaking from my own kind of background in terms of this country. I mean, what is it that means that we have done that in a way that that even in the United Kingdom wasn't done in the same way in terms of Parliament, in terms of a public holiday? The fact that change the date is still on the agenda in circumstances where it took barely 48 hours to declare a day of mourning here for the Queen is ridiculous. And that says to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, you are still invisible. You are still invisible. And that's a real problem, and we need to interrogate why that continues to happen in this country in a variety of areas. 50% of kids in detention here in New South Wales today are Aboriginal. That's disturbing. And yet that's not front page news every single day. I mean, that should be on the news every single day. The fact that this country isn't burning right now astounds me sometimes, because of some of the things that we hide in order to just get through it. But all of that continues, the colonial project that Sen talked about, that's still continuing. And we have to decide quickly whether we're going to be people to try to change it or we're going to be complicit in it.
Yeah, well, point well made. And I think we're, a stark reminder is the fact that there are 23,000 children in state care in Australia. That's half of all children that are in state care are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Is that the same?
Yeah.
It's just, and what's driving that is a poverty poverty narrative that was created by colonisation, and Imania, that those impacts of colonisation are worse for LGBTQIA plus people when there is no acceptance and there's a discrimination, and health service providers are, there's an amount of stigma that goes into walking into a place that is provided by people who are homophobic or transphobic. Or there are queer people who are living in overcrowded homes. Well, how can they be queer in that environment and live into themselves, I guess? Have you got any comments about that?
This is the decolonisation that needs to happen. It's not just, as I said before, it's not decolonisation of law, it's to decolonise the health system, decolonise the media for actually just not talking about what Tim has said. Decolonize these systems. Let's break them down. You can never, ever achieve First Nations justice unless you have given them sovereignty, real sovereignty to determine what is good for them, right? And you cannot give them sovereignty unless you've decolonized. And it's not just a one-step, one-box tick all for decolonization. You need to decolonize the whole thing from top to bottom, right? You need to do that from top to bottom. And everyone in this room, right? Everyone in this room is just hungry for that. They're hungry. They want to help. Let's give them the opportunity. Let's give them the opportunity to help. And I think that is such a powerful thing with our movement, that the L and the B and the G and the I and the T and the A and everyone else in between wants to come together and help each other. More so than humanity. LGBTIQ is the new humanity. We're the ones that we should be setting the examples. We're the ones that we should be breaking down these barriers. But as I said, Narelda, you can never achieve First Nations justice unless they have sovereignty. And for them to have sovereignty, we need decolonization from top to bottom.
Wow. You had a point, Elizabeth?
And I would say for an Indigenous people such as us who are minorities in our own country, is the best thing for Takatapui, the best thing for our Māori who have diverse sexualities, gender, sex characteristics, is give our land back.
We are almost coming to the end, but I have a little prop here. You might have seen these at all the domain parties or on the parade itself. I'm not going to do it now. I'm going to allow our panellists to have a go at this. I'd like them to each make a final point in a way that has become synonymous with Sydney WorldPride, and that is... well, you can watch Elizabeth do it for the first time. So what we're going to do is you're going to make your final point and do it in the fiercest possible way you can. And we're all going, oh, yes, Elizabeth's getting ready to stand up.
Two things I want to mention that I'm most proud of. Number one, when we restructured the health system, and exactly what Imania said, for the first time I was able to put the word takatapui into legislation in our country. It enforces that the government must specifically include our viewpoint in the development of that health system, and from that point we will be able to work on behalf of Rainbow across the whole country. The second thing... The second thing, I want to shout out to my hot Samoan wife over there. Yes, on Saturday, that in and of itself, on Saturday we celebrated 31 years together. Yeah, and so I will say, start a revolution with happy relationships. And
oh, yes. Well done, yes. And Tim, while you get comfortable up there, you've got Pride in Wellington.
Yes.
There's a first happening in Wellington.
Oh yes, I have to leave here to go back to Pride, we're going to have our community march for the first time. We'll come into Parliament, and our local people, our local iwi, for the first time ever, will welcome, on their cultural land, will welcome the entire of our Rainbow community onto Parliament grounds. So it's a big deal for our country.
Elizabeth. Excellent.
Thank you.
All right, Tim Goodwin.
Okay. Yeah, I'm usually terrible at this. I was practicing behind the stage and throwing it and doing terrible, so...
Oh, other way.
I told you. So, look, I kind of want to take up Imania's point around the importance of solidarity, and I think that's what makes true change, is true allyship, and I think there is such a capacity in this community and in the LGBTQIA plus community to not only ensure that there's that solidarity amongst us, but solidarity amongst all peoples who are searching for freedom, who are striving for freedom, who are fighting for justice and equality and equity. And I've benefited from that sense of solidarity as an Aboriginal person and as a gay man, and really want to shout out to the people who are committed to that. And that's really what the invitation that the Uluru Statement represents in many ways, and it was described as an invitation to the Australian public. And so I really want to end on the note that there's an important place to be an ally in that movement, and that the Uluru Statement is not only about a call for a voice, but it's also about truth-telling and about treaty-making. And the treaty-making that is going on in this country is really exciting. That journey, particularly, it's in 6 out of 8 of our state and territory jurisdictions are on a pathway to treaty right now. That's extremely exciting. That's something to be so proud of. And I've seen it firsthand in Victoria, and we're not talking about just a bit of funding and a little bit of the kind of the land that you can do nothing with. There are huge aspirations amongst First Nations communities in Victoria to make treaty sovereign, and that's going to be a really exciting space.
Oh, wonderful. And Imania, as you're getting up, Tim, we need to congratulate you, actually.
31 years, about 4 months.
Yes.
Got married last November, an American-Australian wedding. It was in Hawaii. My husband is a dual citizen of both the United States and America. And as one of my best friends mentioned, I'm a lawyer, thank God he's not. But one of my best friends in his speech mentioned that the reason we were there was a number of important decisions. Loving in Virginia that ended desegregation in America in terms of the marriage of African American people and white Americans. The decision of Oberfeld, which overturned or made marriage equality across the 50 states of the United States, and also the marriage equality here in Australia. And so to everyone that worked on any part of that, and a particular, because I know how hard they worked on it, to honour Anna Brown and Lee Carney, the work that was done here to make that happen, that's why I was able to get married, and so thank you.
Elizabeth, have you got any tips for Tim and Tim's husband?
Oh, I actually
marriage?
I wrote a series of relationship tips. I'll
Right.
send them.
Okay, great. All right, Imania.
Crack.
So there's one thing, one concept that I want all of you to remember about this issue of decolonization. But on that concept hangs a few branches that you should all consider. The concept that I wanted to remind everyone in this room about is the concept of the transferability test, which is, for those of us who are in the islands, for those of us who are First Nations, we run a test to take what is good from the colonial powers and only apply it to our lives, right? Only what's good for us to apply it to our lives. And we need to run that transferability test at all times. It's really, really, really important. The other thing that I wanted to remind, and it hangs off this transferability test, is there is a current